Hey friends, welcome back to the podcast. So glad you're here with us again. And this is episode 2 of our series exploring a really vital, I think, and timely topic, the decline of Christianity in the UK and what the ancient, yet surprisingly modern, Book of Judges can teach us about it.
Last time, you might remember, we looked at the big picture, how the UK really ended up spiritually drifting over the last few generations. We talked about those seismic shifts, the slow erosion of faith, and how it's affected us all. Today, we're going deeper, much deeper. We're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly one of the most frustrating books in the entire Bible. It's a book that's full of drama, chaos, and a repeating pattern that's hard to ignore.
Yes, we're talking about Judges. It's truly dramatic. It's absolutely chaotic. It's full of incredible miracles, profound mess, outright rebellion, unexpected rescue, and then back to rebellion again. It's this relentless, cyclical narrative. And yes, you might be thinking this already, but it is exactly what the UK feels like spiritually right now. The echoes are undeniable. So, let's get into it. This is going to be an eye-opening conversation, I promise you.
If you've ever read the Book of Judges, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The whole book just feels like ancient Israel is stuck in a spiritual washing machine, the same cycle spinning over and over again on repeat. It's almost maddening to read, because you just want them to learn their lesson, but they don't, not really.
Here's the pattern, simplified. It's a 6-step dance of doom, really. First, Israel serves God. Things are good, they remember his covenant. Then, second, Israel forgets God and gradually drifts into sin, often adopting the idols and practices of the surrounding nations. Third, consequences inevitably hit, usually in the form of oppression by another nation, God allowing their enemies to gain power over them. Fourth, Israel cries out to God in their distress, finally remembering who their true deliverer is. Fifth, God in his mercy raises a leader, a judge, to rescue them from their oppressors. And then, finally, peace returns to the land for a generation or so, until the cycle starts all over again with the next generation. It's relentless.
The key verse that truly sums up the entire book, I think, is this one from Judges 3:7. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God. Just let that sink in for a moment. Notice that crucial word, forgot. It's not rejected. It's not rebelled because they hated him. It's just forgot. Their faith simply faded into the background. Daily life got busy, as it always does. Cultural influences grew louder, more appealing, more pervasive. And eventually, tragically, God became a distant memory, a vague concept rather than a living reality. Does that sound like any nation you know, perhaps one we discussed last week? I think it sounds eerily familiar.
Let me paint a picture for you, a storytelling moment to really bring this home, to illustrate this slow drift. Imagine an Israelite family living a generation or two after the mighty Joshua, after all those incredible miracles they'd heard about. Let's call them Eliab and Miriam. Now they've heard stories of Jericho, of the walls falling down, of the Red Sea parting, but they didn't see it with their own eyes. They know the law, sure, but mostly because their parents talked about it sometimes, maybe read a passage now and then. It's not deeply ingrained.
And one year they decided to skip a major festival because, well, it had been a really stressful season, you know how it is. Next year they're just too tired, too preoccupied with their crops or their children. A few years later, their own children don't even really know the festival exists or why it's important. The drift didn't feel dramatic to them. It didn't feel like a conscious rejection. It felt practical. It felt reasonable. It felt normal. Their faith wasn't attacked. It was just deprioritized, quietly sidelined in the rush of life. This, my friends, is exactly how decline always begins. It's rarely a sudden earthquake. It's usually a slow, almost imperceptible erosion.
And here's where the UK fits in so perfectly. The way Christianity declined here wasn't through some mass rebellion or devastating war or overt persecution, thankfully. No, it declined through that same slow, cultural drift. A gentle but persistent current that pulled people away from the shores of faith, without them even realizing how far they'd gone until they looked back.
Let's overlay this ancient pattern from Judges onto modern Britain, because the parallels are just too striking to ignore. First, a generation knows God. Think back to post-war Britain just a few generations ago. Churches were full. Hymns were on the radio. Youth groups were everywhere, thriving. Faith was a bedrock of society, deeply embedded in public life and private homes. But you know eyes. Illicini, he's our vacuum, Pashurus.
Then second, a generation forgets. As prosperity rose, as society became more secular, faith became assumed, it became cultural, it became optional. Parents got busy, caught up in the demands of modern life. Family discipleship, that intentional passing on of faith, faded into the background. Faith turned increasingly private, a personal hobby rather than a communal identity or a guiding principle for life. The stories weren't told as often.
Third, the culture shifts profoundly. The 60s, 70s, and 80s brought seismic cultural changes to Britain. Christianity, which had long been the moral compass of society, gradually lost its privileged place. Its voice became one among many, often drowned out by new ideologies, new freedoms, and new ways of thinking about morality and meaning. What was once central became peripheral.
Fourth, a generation is spiritually directionless. Enter today's Britain, a nation spiritually confused, morally fractured, culturally anxious, and desperately, truly desperately, searching for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unmoored. There's a void, and people are feeling it keenly. Many young people today simply don't have a framework for understanding faith.
And fifth, people cry out in crisis. And quietly, and this is where the hope comes in, especially among young people, we're starting to see new curiosity, new spiritual hunger, a new longing for meaning and belonging that wasn't there before. It's a quiet hum, but it's growing louder. The cycle continues, my friends. The pattern is unfolding before our very eyes.
The pressing question for us today is this: will this be the moment we rise up, like the judges of old, or will we simply repeat the same pattern, allowing the drift to continue unchecked? It's a challenge, but also a profound opportunity. We have some incredible insights from Dr. Helen McBride, a renowned biblical scholar who focuses on Old Testament history, particularly the narratives of Judges and the early kingdom period.
Israel was constantly forgetting God precisely because they never built deep structures of remembrance. They relied heavily on the past generation's experience, the stories of their parents and grandparents, but they failed to cultivate their own personal and communal encounters with God. When a nation, or even a family, depends solely on the second-hand faith of its ancestors, rather than having fresh, personal encounters with God, that spiritual drift is not only inevitable, it's predictable. The faith becomes a relic, not a living relationship.
Wow. That sounds strikingly like what we see playing out in the UK right now, doesn't it? This reliance on an inherited faith that wasn't personally owned. I mean, we've had generations who saw faith as a cultural given, not a personal conviction. What happens when that cultural support system weakens?
Exactly. Cultural Christianity is always fragile. It only lasts as long as the culture actively supports it, or at least doesn't actively oppose it. Once the culture shifts, whether you're talking about ancient Canaanite influences creeping into Israel, or the profound secularization and pluralism we've seen in modern Britain, that inherited faith collapses. It simply cannot sustain itself unless it has been intentionally, consistently, and deeply transmitted within homes, within families, and within vibrant intentional communities. The foundations need to be laid anew, generation after generation.
That's such a critical point, intentionally transmitted. All right, let's get even more practical for a moment. Why do people, specifically, forget God? What are the mechanisms at play here? The spiritual diagnosis that Dr. McBride is pointing to.
Reason number one, life gets comfortable. When things are easy, when there's no immediate crisis or threat, faith can feel optional, a nice to have rather than a necessity. When the stomach is full and the house is warm, the urgent need for divine intervention can recede. This isn't just about wealth, it's about a lack of perceived need.
Reason number two, culture gets louder. Ancient Canaan had its idols, its fertility cults, its tempting pagan practices that pulled Israel away. We, in modern Britain, have our own potent idols: careerism, the relentless pursuit of achievement, the overwhelming noise of digital media constantly vying for our attention, and endless entertainment, numbing us to deeper longings. These aren't evil in themselves, but they can easily become ultimate concerns, replacing God at the center.
Reason number three, faith becomes assumed. This is a huge one. Parents stop actively teaching their children about God because they assume the children will just pick it up or figure it out. Church becomes a routine, a ritual to attend rather than a place of transformational encounter. Kids inherit the outward rituals, maybe attend Sunday school for a few years, but they don't inherit a vibrant personal relationship with God. It's like inheriting an old house but never learning to live in it.
And reason number four, which ties into all of this, no one tells the story anymore. In Judges, the powerful stories of God's deliverance weren't consistently repeated, generation after generation. In the UK, Bible reading, family prayers, spiritual conversations, they largely disappeared from the home. And when stories disappear, when the narrative of who you are and whose you are fades, identity disappears with it. You become untethered, floating without an anchor in a sea of changing values.
To get a ground-level perspective on this, with Sarah Linton, who is a church planter working with young families, right there on the front lines of this generational shift, work with a generation often described as spiritually detached.
What I overwhelmingly see is a generation with almost zero biblical literacy. And I don't mean that critically, it's just the reality. They aren't rejecting Christianity out of defiance, not generally speaking. They simply never received it in the first place. They don't know the foundational stories, they don't understand the key symbols, they haven't been exposed to the Christian worldview. It never truly reached them in a meaningful, accessible way. It's as if a whole language went unspoken for decades. They're starting from scratch, if that makes sense.
So, what you're saying is the primary issue isn't a rebellion against faith or a conscious turning away, but rather an absence of any meaningful transmission of faith. It just wasn't there for them.
Exactly. And that again looks so much like Judges, doesn't it? When faith stops being intentionally taught, nurtured, and lived out within families and communities, something else always fills that vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human spirit. Culture steps in, media steps in, new ideologies step in. People will always look for meaning. If they don't find it in the gospel, they'll find it somewhere else, often in places that leave them feeling emptier in the long run. It's not malice, it's just neglect.
That's such a profound observation and so key to understanding our moment. But here's the hopeful part. And yes, I promise you there is one, even in the midst of all this. Every single time Israel fell into chaos, every single time they forgot God, every single time society broke down and seemed beyond repair, God, in his incredible faithfulness and mercy, raised a leader. He raised a judge, a deliverer, a restorer, someone to turn the tide. These weren't perfect people, mind you. Trust me, some of these judges are deeply, deeply flawed, morally complex figures with real struggles and sins. Yet God used them anyway, in their imperfection, to bring about his purposes.
And I truly, genuinely believe God is raising people in the UK right now too. Ordinary people, young leaders, mums and dads who are trying to raise their kids with faith, dedicated teachers, creative artists, thoughtful pastors, tech workers with a burden for their generation, small group leaders faithfully serving, people who deep down sense that things simply cannot continue as they are, people who feel that spiritual hunger, that longing for something more, people who are willing to step into the gap, people like you perhaps, listening right now.
So what can we as listeners, as followers of Jesus, do with this powerful insight from the book of Judges? Let's end with what I believe are the 3 most important lessons from this ancient book for the UK today, lessons that can guide our actions and renew our hope.
Lesson number 1. We must recognize the cycle. We cannot hope to change what we don't first acknowledge. We need to look honestly at our history, at our present, and say, without shame or blame, but with clarity, yes, we drifted. We forgot. We need to call it what it is, understand the pattern, and see where we are within it. That awareness is the very first step toward change, toward breaking free from that washing machine cycle.
Lesson number 2. We must fight forgetfulness with stories. If the problem was forgetting, the solution is remembering. We need to tell the stories again, loudly, clearly, consistently. In our homes, around the dinner table, in our churches, through sermons and teachings, online, through engaging content and conversations, everywhere. The stories of God's faithfulness, of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, of the powerful work of the Holy Spirit. These stories are our identity, our anchor, our hope. We must reclaim the narrative.
And lesson number 3, we need to cry out and step up. Renewal always begins when God's people humble themselves and cry out to Him in earnest prayer, acknowledging their dependence, their need. But it doesn't end there. It continues when they step up, when ordinary people, empowered by God's Spirit, courageously take action, just as the judges did. We are not doomed to decline, friends. History, both ancient and modern, shows us that spiritual renewal often starts at the lowest point, when the need is greatest, when the desperation finally compels people to look up. And the UK, in its current spiritual landscape, may be closer to a turning point than anyone truly realizes. This is not a time for despair, but a time for strategic hope and faithful action.
That's it for episode 2, the cycle of faith and forgetfulness. I really hope this conversation has given you a clearer, deeper picture of what's going on beneath the surface of our cultural moment, and perhaps a renewed sense of what's possible. It's heavy, but it's full of hope too.
Next episode, we're going to tackle one of the most honest questions in this whole series, and it's one I hear a lot. Why didn't we pass faith on effectively? Where, specifically, did the generational transmission break down? Episode 3 is going to be incredibly eye-opening, especially if you're a parent, a grandparent, a youth leader, or even a young adult who feels like the church might have missed you growing up. We're going to dive into the practicalities of that breakdown.
If this episode encouraged you, if it sparked something in you, please do us a favor and share it with someone you know. The more we talk about these patterns, the more we can understand them, and ultimately, the more we can break them and step into a new future. Thank you for listening, for being part of this vital conversation, and we'll see you in episode 3.